medically understood.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and this is the Ultraviolet Podcast. And today, I have the pleasure of being joined once again by Aaron Rabinowitz. Aaron is a lecturer in philosophy at Rutgers University, and he is the host of the Embrace the Void podcast, as well as the Philosophers in Space podcast. Regular listeners of the show may remember Aaron from about 15 or so episodes back when we had a debate about moral realism, which was a really fun conversation despite us not being in complete alignment on that subject. But today, Aaron is back to talk about something where I more or less completely agree with him, which is to make the case for moral luck and a pedagogy of moral luck, of teaching people what moral luck is, how they can integrate that into their daily lives, and how doing so can make us a kinder, more egalitarian culture, how it can improve our lives measurably and immensely. It was a really fun conversation. I was really happy to get Aaron back on the show. He is a very, very busy man. He runs 2 podcasts. He's a philosophy lecturer, and he's presently working on his PhD, so we definitely appreciate him carving out some time to come and talk to me. As far as content warnings go, we talk about the criminal justice system, crime and punishment, the fact that we live in a techno-dystopia, and it wouldn't be a philosophy discussion about free will and moral luck if we didn't bring up a couple cringy hypothetical thought experiments involving serial killers and pedophilia. Those are more towards the end of the show. But yeah, that's all stuff that we touch on. If any of that's going to cause you psychic damage, then you know the drill by now. I will not think any less of you or take personal offense if you decide to skip this one. For everybody else, I will see you on the other side of the jump, and I will not keep you from Aaron any longer. So I give you Aaron Rabinowitz. Aaron Rabinowitz, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It's good to have you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back on.
So you are currently, you have a master's in philosophy, and you are currently working on a PhD in education with an eye towards, I think the way you phrase it is a pedagogy of moral luck. And so that's what we're going to talk about mostly today is just the concept of moral luck and how we can interface it or use it to interface with the world around us. And this is an area where, admittedly, I am not super well educated, but I think from everything that I've heard from you and have read on the subject, we're pretty much in total alignment here. So
that makes things easy.
Yeah. So I'm basically going to just let you tell everybody how it works and what it is because you're the expert here. So, yeah.
I don't know if I'll go with the expert, but I spent way too much time thinking about the concept of luck. What I'm working on is towards this thing I'm calling pedagogy of luck, which does draw heavily on these concepts of moral luck and epistemic luck and basically the way that luck pervades everything in our lives. My personal view that leads me into this, and I inherit this from reading a Nagel paper that we'll probably talk about, where I, buy very deeply into the argument but maybe even more deeply than Nagel himself, into the argument that he's making. And I end up in a place where I think that everything is luck all the way down. And that has pretty substantial implications for moral responsibility, for fairness, for all of these concepts and how we interact with almost every field that we engage with in the world. So the idea of moral luck in particular, what this technically refers to is situations where somebody is held morally responsible for something that is beyond their control, something that is the result of luck in a sense, right? So we all have, it seems like, fairly universally the case, humans seem to have this strong intuition that moral responsibility depends on control, right? That you could only be held responsible for something if you were in control of your actions in some sense when you did those things, right? We can make a toy example where if you weren't, if I took over your body with a mind control device and went on a killing spree, it would be weird for us to then hold you morally responsible for that killing spree. Moral luck are situations where we do that weird thing and hold somebody responsible despite knowing that it is beyond their control in some sense.
Yeah. And that would be I think that's what Nagel calls the control principle, right? Where
Right.
you are only responsible for the things that you have specific, conscious, causal control over. So, like, I would be, well, maybe going causal would be a little too far.
It's a little
But
more, it's complicated what we mean by having something under your control, but in
yeah,
some sense, right? If you are not in control, then we can't hold you responsible.
and I can't remember if Nagel uses the example of the drunk driver or not in this
Yeah,
paper.
he
Is that what
does.
you? Okay. So you'll probably explain that example better than I can, but I think that really highlights kind of what we're talking about at a broad view.
Sure, yeah. So Nagel lays out this now very famous example of the drunk drivers. You have two drunk drivers who simultaneously engage in the exact same action, right?
Mhm.
They both drive drunk and therefore put people at risk in theory. What happens is in one case the individual, so let's say the version I think he uses, in both cases they drive up onto the sidewalk at one point because they're
Mhm.
drunk, right? But in one case, the person is lucky in the sense that there is nobody on the sidewalk at the time, so they don't kill anybody. Whereas in the other case, there's a small child on the sidewalk, and so they kill them. Right. So the question is there a difference morally between how we should view those two individuals? Right.
Mhm.
And if you take seriously the control condition and you say, well, look, whether or not there was a child on the sidewalk or not was beyond their control, and that's literally the only difference between them. If you want to treat them differently, then you've got a weird problem with your control condition intuition, right? And so if you don't want to jettison that, then you got to go in other weird directions, basically.
Yeah. The other example that I'm fond of is the like the attempted murderer example. I think where, like,
Hmm.
say you and I get into an argument and I pull a gun and I aim it at your
Hmm.
face and I pull the trigger with the full intention of shooting you in the face and ending your life.
Hmm.
Uh, Maybe I won't say you, maybe somebody else that might poison the well for the conversation.
It's fine. I would likely deserve it. So
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, that complicates things further.
nobody deserves anything on this field. Let me back up and make that clear.
All right, so two people on
Uh-huh.
the street get into an argument, and one of them pulls out a firearm with the intention of executing the other person. They have a full, complete, perfect intention of ending the life of this person in front of them. And they complete the action that is necessary to accomplish that goal, which is aiming the firearm at their head. Like, they can even do like a contact shot, like right up against their dome piece. And
Right.
they pull the trigger.
Uh-huh.
And in one version of events, they do kill that person.
Hmm.
And in another version of events, it just so happens that the person at the precise moment that the trigger was pulled slipped on a banana peel and they fell down and the shot missed and just grazed their head.
Right.
And you have somebody in both of those versions of events, you have an individual who did precisely the same thing with precisely the same intention. And the only difference is that a random event changed the outcome. And
Hmm.
yet, so, like, our moral intuitions are that, well, they get fuzzy there. Like, should
Right.
we have the intuition that you shouldn't be held responsible for actions out of your control? But our legal system does treat those circumstances differently. Like, we don't prosecute attempted murder with the
Hmm.
same severity as we do actual murder, even if the only difference between them is random chance. And so there's a
Right.
fuzziness there that we need to, like, explore and figure out.
Yeah, and I don't think our intuitions actually are consistent, right? I think we have
Agreed.
an incoherent sort of mess of intuitions in this area. And so these sort of examples, the goal of them is to lay out sort of kinds of luck or kinds of
Mm,
moral luck that, these categories of ways in which things can sort of be beyond your control. Nagel lays out four of them, one of which is probably redundant, but the main things we need to keep in mind here are things like consequential luck, which is what we're seeing in these examples, right? Of like the luck and how things turn out. And
mhm,
then you have what I would argue are the more difficult to deal with issues of circumstantial and luck of character, constitutive luck. There it is. A lot
mhm,
of C words there, right? So constitutive luck is all the things that go into making you who you are. Circumstantial luck is things like, do you accidentally get born into Nazi Germany or not?
mhm,
Things like that, right? What challenges you face in your life. And So what you basically see in the literature, roughly speaking, right, this becomes a big issue because of these two papers, one by Nagel and the other by, I think it's Russell. I always freak out when I talk about this because I'm like, is it Russell?
I actually have it written down in my phone.
Yeah, but I'm pretty certain. Yes, or is it Williams? I always get freaked out about whether it's Bernard Williams or Russell.
It's Williams.
Okay, thank you very much. So Williams writes the first paper on the subject, or the first sort of big piece in this sort of modern trajectory of discussions around luck, where he focuses his toy experiment is actually Gauguin, the painter, sculptor, who, the question is like, is it okay for him to abandon his family and go live in the South Seas or whatever in order to become a better artist? And like, is it whether it's okay depend on whether his art is good enough to justify that behavior? So a different kind of consequential luck there, right? But still the same kind of broad idea. That paper is not sort of as influential, I think, as the Nagel one. I think arguably the Nagel paper goes deeper into the issue and like raises the sort of paradox, the problem more clearly, and they come to somewhat different conclusions, though I should even say it's not even entirely clear what Nagel's conclusions ultimately are at the end of his paper on moral luck.
Yeah. I get the vibe that Nagel was just like sort of doing the like meme of like right. Fundamentally, he's just like, look at this. This is a thing that we need to figure out. I don't think he really like hammers home on how we should interpret the thing that he's saying so much.
Yeah, and the book that's in, Mortal Questions, that he writes, which is one of my favorite philosophy books, in the intro, he basically says, I prefer questions to answers, or I trust questions more than answers. And I think there's a sort of broad, what we call like a mysterian, like giving into the mystery approach to philosophy that I think I'm sympathetic to, that goes along with a Hegelian kind of approach, which is to say, here's this really big problem that we don't have a clear resolution for. So in the same book, he talks about things like the mind body, like the hard problem of consciousness kind of stuff, what it's like to be a bat is in there, all these sorts of very, very, very big problems for which I don't think we have clear answers, many of which tie around the issue of the subjective-objective divide. And that's one way you can talk about moral luck, but I don't think it's necessarily the one that I want to lead people towards for the most part when discussing this in like an educational space. I don't think it's necessarily the best way to think about it compared to other approaches potentially. Basically the problem as I see it as an educator is, here's this argument that does seem correct to me, that like luck is pervasive. What do we teach our students about that, about morality in relation to that? And like, that's a problem we need to be careful about, because there's interesting evidence that if you do this poorly, you could mess your students up real bad. Essentially, right? This is not like a low stakes topic when it comes to teaching students about the pervasive role of luck in their lives.
Yeah. Like for sure. Like, and I think we see that daily played out on Twitter. But I want to go back, and before we get specifically into the pedagogy, I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, which is our moral intuitions being fuzzy in different places. And it's something I've been thinking about, and it relates to this specific topic. And I think I started thinking about this in a Twitter thread where mostly you and Ben Burgess, but also I was like throwing shots in there too. We're talking about this subject. And Ben ultimately comes down, I think, and I don't want to like put words in his mouth, but I think he comes down very much on like a deontological side of things, where people's moral intuition should be, or that there's this like categorical things are right or wrong, and our intuitions are maybe a guide to what those are, is sort of the vibe that I get from what he's saying. And if I'm wrong about that, Ben, I'll let you clarify, but I think that's what I'm getting from him. But
yeah, I don't necessarily speak for Ben either. I think he and I definitely seem to disagree on like how to talk about luck and the pervasiveness of it, and issues around free will and compatibilism, which is another issue that's very closely connected to what we're talking about here. Now, both of our views could, in theory, I'm not sure what his normative ethical views are about like utilitarianism versus deontology, actually.
He did say specifically he's a deontologist and wears it on his sleeve.
And like, you could be a deontologist on my moral luck view. Now, what's interesting about that response is that it brings up another aspect of the literature about moral luck, which is, in the Nagel paper, he uses Immanuel Kant as his sort of stalking horse for his argument. And, we could debate how much Kant actually holds that view. There's a really good, I actually just finished reading a great book about philosophy and psychology of luck. And it had a whole chapter about is it fair to peg Kant in this kind of way? But for now, let's just do that, right? So the view is essentially, well, what we can do is we can deal with consequential luck by saying we're going to attach moral responsibility to intentions, right? We're going to look inward and look at the inner choices of the individual. Now, on that view, something like the drunk driver case is going to be, you have to hold them equally morally responsible because their intentions were exactly the same, right? They acted on the same maxims, to use Kant's phrasing here, right? So what does that then mean policy-wise? Do we treat them both equally severely, right? Do you treat the person who didn't kill somebody like they killed somebody, which is going to be a weird choice, right? But we're close to that, right? In the sense that, like, America's policies about drunk driving in a very, I think, consequentialist kind of way, were like, we're going to treat you like you've already hit somebody, basically. And that helped, I think, right? I think probably reduced, but like you could have debates about, like, is that a good approach if it's criminalizing lots of individuals? Should we have better approaches? I'm not here to like come down hard on one way or the other on that, but like you can see how even if you make the kind of Kantian deontological move of focusing in on intentions, it doesn't solve the problem. It makes you have to bite different weird bullets than the view that I'm presenting, right? But there's still weird bullets to bite in there, for sure.
I think the one that he and I ultimately like kind of came to loggerheads over was he and this is again specifically about like moral intuitions. He was like, if you reduce everything to luck, then you remove from the situation the primacy of that there's something to a intentional negative action or lack of responsibility that most people intuitively assign moral value to. And the examples used were somebody who like intentionally does a negative thing that causes many people to die versus I think somebody who is a plague carrier for a pathogen that they're unaware that they have. Like in both situations, the person is unlucky in one regard or another. In one case, they were unlucky to be exposed to the pathogen and a vector for it. In the other, they were unlucky to be the sort of person who would do the bad thing. And that there is this intuition that the one is worse than the other in most people. And I think that's true that the intuition exists, but I don't necessarily know that that intuition is something we should cling to. Because the way I look at it, and I think you'll vibe with this as a moral realist, we forgive you for that. It works for this example. Our intuitions are reasonable enough guides for describing the world when we have nothing else to go by. But when we have other tools available to us to better understand the natural world than our intuitions, we generally tend to use those. For instance, I am a creature whose ancestors evolved to hunt small game over the savanna. My intuition is that I live on a flat disk around which a ball orbits, and that's the sun. That's my intuition. I don't believe that because I have access to better tools of analysis than my intuition. And I don't see why, if there is a moral truth to the universe, that it exists and is real, that it should in any way automatically conform to what my limited intuitional sense is any more than the structure of the physical world. So I don't see that as being like I don't see intuition as being the gotcha that I think people who repose upon intuition seem to think that it is.
Yeah, well, and I'll be honest, I'm an intuitionist in moral philosophy. But like, I'm an intuitionist in the sense that I think we don't have better options, right? Setting aside the question of whether or not they're, like the other thing is better or not. Like, we don't have other options, right? Much less better options when it comes, I think, to our moral foundations and to doing ethical work. We can't build machines that can measure the moral world the way that we can build machines that can measure the natural world. So that is just, like a limitation that we deal with. Now, I think we are able, through our reasoning, through our arguments, through our emotions, through all sorts of things, to bootstrap ourselves up to moral knowledge, and that's what I think we do. But I want to get to this. I think this is a subtle concern with my view that I often hear raised by sort of Marxist adjacent, critical theory adjacent, potentially kinds of individuals. So it's, I think it's not totally unsurprising that like Ben is also maybe sympathetic to that kind of view as well, potentially. It is the concern that my view deprives individuals of agency, of autonomy in the Kantian sense. And when you're a deontologist, if something doesn't have autonomy, then it's potentially deprived of its intrinsic moral value, right? And so what's lost is this idea of humans as these intrinsically valuable moral agents or something like that, right? I think there's a couple of like a cluster of concerns really at play there. So let me try to tease apart a couple of them. So I, for example, believe in intrinsic value and believe in the intrinsic value of sentient beings. And I don't think that intrinsic value is in any way dependent on them having free will or agency. I think that intrinsic value arises from the ability to have phenomenal states of consciousness, that there's something it's like to be you and it can be better or worse. And that's like all we need to be off to the races on this sort of thing. So I disagree with Kant about that kind of founding, needing to have agency. And I think there's huge problems with if you're dependent on an autonomy-based view, you're going to exclude some people from the moral community that I don't think should be excluded. In that kind of way, or you're going to manage some workaround that essentially agrees with what I'm saying as another sort of moral foundation, right? So I don't think you have to abandon intrinsic value on my view. Now, do you have to abandon the sort of appealing notion of humans as these individuals who act in free ways and could be praised and rewarded and all? Like, it has to change. It does have to shift some. I'm not going to pretend like nothing changes on my view, because I do think things radically change on this view. I don't think, though, that it involves an abandoning of the valuing of what we, like a deflated version of autonomy, right? So like on my view, it isn't the case that we're immediately going to have to jump to like a Brave New World approach where everybody gets brainwashed and that's the best thing or something like that. Like, you can still think on my view that it's good to allow individuals to have the kind of luck where they can have the maximal experience of what we think of as agency, which is to say, you get to choose what job you do in your life. You get to choose what hobbies you do. You get to choose where you live, maybe. And like, we want to improve people's material resources so that they can have more of those kinds of freedoms. And that is all compatible with saying, and the choices that they make in doing, in that world are still going to be luck all the way down. We're just improving the quality of the luck that they are experiencing, right? We're making it so that they're having better kinds of luck. So I think you can still value autonomy, quote unquote, agency as a moral foundation in my view, and recognize that like, what you are valuing is sort of the experience of something that is ultimately illusory, and that illusoriness doesn't make it less valuable, but it does change how we should treat people, in terms of things like criminal justice or such, or education.
Do you think that there's any value to the approach of, even if we may, in a very real sense, be luck all the way down and lack agency in the way that people who are opposed to that idea think of it, that there is a utility in, or usefulness in, present sort of like a compatible view between the two? I think Sean Carroll is a big fan of this view, where we understand, like, logically, and to use our sense making muscles, we get that we get that people are luck all the way down. We can say that and assent to that and not have a problem with it. But in our day-to-day lives, we have the social construct of a human being as a causal agent who has a control over their actions in a very real way. And we have systems that sort of build up from that concept, and we can still maintain not necessarily the illusion of it, but sort of the the
Mm-hmm.
use case of it in our day-to-day lives without, we can have our cake and eat it too, essentially, when it comes to agency. Do you think that that's a view that holds, or do you disagree with that?
Yeah, so I actually just finished up a paper that I'm going to try to submit for publication, working towards the dissertation stuff about sort of this specific question from
Mm-hmm.
a like psych perspective, like what is the actual data on this is basically a noble lie approach, right? And there's actually
Mm-hmm.
a guy who wrote a whole book about this argument where he essentially lays out that we should adopt this kind of noble lie. Like he fully agrees with me on the like free will
Mm-hmm.
side of things, but says, but we should still pretend that like people have free will and have control in these kinds of ways. I think the evidence is actually not super strongly necessarily in favor of that position, right? So there is some evidence that suggests that, especially if you teach these issues in such a way where you, I think, increase people's fatalism, people's view that like their actions don't matter in a robust sense, or so various
Mm-hmm.
kinds of nihilism, then you can produce worse outcomes. You can produce antisocial behaviors and things like that. But there's also some good evidence that, like, if you genuinely shift someone's views about moral luck more towards my position, you can see things like increased compassion, reduced sort of hubris to some extent about certain kinds of things because you're more cognizant of the sort of limitations that luck puts on all of us in these kind of ways. So, this is why my pedagogy stuff is ultimately that, like, what I think we need to do is reduce people's belief in free will and increase their belief in the pervasiveness of luck while doing specific kinds of techniques that I think will help them avoid the slide into fatalism or nihilism. I think that is the better approach. And I think it's a better approach because I think the noble lie approach, is unsustainable for anybody who thinks about this for any length of time. And like in
Mm-hmm.
the book that I was citing, he basically, when he gets to the part where he's like, well, how are we going to maintain this? Like, what's our policies for, keeping everybody believing this thing? He's basically like, well, look, humans mostly believe in free will, right? Mostly they take a sort of naive pro free will, pro compatibilism or something like that approach, if not a libertarian view, right? All we have to do is, like, scientists and philosophers need to shut up about this stuff a little bit. Like, don't bring it up quite so much. Don't push so hard and say that, like, the science really clearly proves, or the arguments in philosophy really clearly prove that you genuinely don't have free will. And then, like, our natural inclinations will take care of the rest.
Oh, that's a much stronger view of that view than I've encountered before. Where your like noble lie is not being used euphemistically, like literally, we should just stop talking about it. I've not encountered that. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, and like I think it's mostly just I don't think it's a very plausible approach in the modern age, right? Like we
Mhm.
all have the internet now. It's full of the YouTubes, which are full of the people debating about things like free will all the time, right? So
Yeah.
like people are gonna, and I think there's been actually potentially a rise in interest in arguments like these, like big philosophical arguments, because there is a space now where people can argue about them more and
Mhm.
have these videos and things that they watch. And so it's more, like we're all more amateur philosophers than we used to be, I think, because people demand that we like, defend our views online all the time
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, like I have this habit of whenever somebody gives me a particularly nasty or funny insult on my YouTube videos, I make a T-shirt out of it and just put it on my
Hmm.
Redbubble store. And my favorite one thus far was somebody calling me a philosophical dilettante,
Mm.
which is absolutely true. And I think that's
Hmm.
true of, like you said, a lot of people. Where a lot of people have become armchair philosophers just out of necessity in order to keep up with the discourse. And
Right.
I think that's a good thing, right? Like, I think,
Oh yeah, I
yeah,
want
if
to
you're,
make clear. I'm very pro everybody becoming a philosopher. I don't want to
yeah,
suggest that I'm like an elitist about like who should and shouldn't do philosophy. No, and that's why I'm like, my view is you shouldn't try to hold back the floodgates of arguments about
mhm,
free will. Like you should let this stuff run rampant. And like if that means that more people disbelieve in free will, then we need to think about how to help them with what that worldview means.
yeah.
And so yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to get into your like the specifics of like teaching people how to interface with this idea because, and you made this really wonderful chart, and I'll put it up on screen on YouTube and link to it in the show notes. But it basically sort of shows that if you onboard this idea of sort of a moral luck all the way down or luck all the way down, there's two directions you can broadly go in terms of the different questions that we ask in terms of social justice. And one is the nihilistic view, and the other is the I don't know how you put it, but like the pro-social, like healthy view, the
Right.
the one where we don't all sit in our house and just die. That view, the good one. And there are different ways to do this, and if you teach somebody this idea without introducing, it's sort of like agitation and union work. Like if you agitate somebody without giving them the solution in the same conversation, what you've done is black-pilled somebody completely.
Right. Especially if you tell them that they have a power that they don't have. Right. So a lot of this discussion for me is about, it ties in with sort of social justice discussions around, like recognitions of systemic injustice, systemic poverty, things like that, where there is the dark side of that like noble lie approach is that it involves a lot of times propping up like these myths of meritocracy and such like that to keep people from, as you say, becoming black-pilled by the reality that they are dealing with, where like no amount of their hard work is actually resulting in a better quality of life or something like that. So yeah, I think we need to be more honest with folks about this, and we can be, and then like we can have valuable conversations about what does that then mean for us in our day-to-day lives. And I like, I want to do more research on this, obviously, and I've actually just gotten approved for my first human pilot study about these sorts of issues. It's ridiculous they're letting a philosopher study humans, but I think there's some good, at least initial evidence in the research that's already been done around free will and beliefs about luck and outcomes and things like that suggest if you stay away from talk of destiny and fate and nihilism and like fatalism and things like that, and focus in on, here are ways that let me give just one example, right? On the classic approach, you look at something like crime, and as you say, the solution is put all the criminals in jail, right? Disincentivize them to be criminals by having punishment or something like that, and behaviors will change or something like that. On this view, you would take a larger view of the sort of causal network that goes into criminal behavior, and you would say, we can't just focus in on the individuals. We have to look at like the economic situations that they are in, the social situations that they are in. Are they being stigmatized or dehumanized in various kinds of ways that are resulting in them lashing out in ways that make them feel like they have agency again, right? So it's the sort of idea that like if you tell people they have agency but you deprive them of it at the same time, they will sort of violently lash out to regain that sense of agency, and like I don't think we want that. So I think there are alternatives.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Is we, just as there is a negative way to teach somebody the idea of moral luck that induces nihilism, that is not a problem specific to the concept of moral luck. The current system that we have, I think, actually engenders nihilism more readily because we are lying to people about, like, that's the whole conservative, like, bootstrap hustle culture thing, is we're lying to people about that. Like, there's Jocko's entire bit is telling people who really maybe can't do the things that he's saying that they can do if they just work a little harder, can do those things if they work a little harder, and if they fail, it's their fault. And that's just a recipe for blackpilling people, right?
And I mean, this is where I feel like me and the Marxists tend to be on the same page for the most part. And like, if you can settle the question of like, how do we still maintain some sort of sense of agency in this kind of view? Like, they're very sympathetic in my experience to this recognition that, the society sets up a system in which you create that kind of reproduction of people being in these different levels and staying in these different levels and being black-pilled in such a way where they don't change the system or address these kinds of problems. I think economic progressivism in the idea that like we have, it's we can't say uniformly move towards a more just economic system because we have massive wealth inequality, but where we have seen progress made on things like social security, I think it is rooted in these ideas that like we should protect people from the worst of life, because for a lot of people, experiencing the worst of life is the result of factors, I'd say all of them, right, is experiencing factors beyond their control in this sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I feel like if you onboard the idea in the right way, it makes you more compassionate ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
It,
Mm-hmm.
it, if I look at the world and I think, not only do I not have as much control over my actions as I thought that I did previously before this moment, but so does
Mm-hmm.
everybody else, including the person that I'm angry at or who I think isn't working hard enough, or, pick a vice or virtue. And I just recognize that this is at bottom, a
Mm-hmm.
collection of circumstances doing what those circumstances would logically imply that they do.
Mm-hmm.
Then that sort of like, I think if you care about the subjective experience of those collections of circumstances that we call human beings, then it demands of you to create a world where those circumstances are better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you have better personal psychological experiences to some extent, right? And this is this sort of where it shades into a kind of mindfulness thing a little bit, where it takes some of the bite. Or you're never going to stop, in my opinion, experiencing anger or other kinds of emotional
Yeah.
reactions to people acting unethically. And I want to make very clear, I do think people still act unethically on this view. This is mostly a concern about what kind of responsibility can we hold people to, and how should we treat them based on whether they, it's still wrong to murder somebody on my view. The question is there really any difference in terms of like the thoroughgoing sociopath who lacks control and so murders somebody, or someone else who does it, because they experience nonstop, systemic oppression and eventually lash out violently in a moment of rage or something like that, right? Like, is there really any fundamental difference there? I don't think there ultimately is. But I do think that like we should still try to help people to act better, and I think we actually get better at teaching people to be more ethical if we take this view more seriously than the sort of traditional model. Other things. Oh, I also want to mention, we've been using the term control a lot here, and I didn't disambiguate this, but this is a big part of when I do this stuff.
Mhm.
One thing that I think folks get hung up on is thinking, well, look, I have control over whether I pick up my arm, whether I go to work, whether I move around, stuff like that. Like, that seems to be a kind of control. Why can't I be responsible based on that? And what I think of as that is the kind of like causal efficacy level of things, right? Like, no one is denying that you have the physical efficacy to move things around your room or something like that, right? What's being denied here is that if we look at any one of your actions, or any set of your actions, right, and try to trace them back, what was the reason you did it? Why was that reason motivational for you? What about your character made it effective for you? We eventually trace these things back to things that are not under your control in any kind of sense, right? So this is what I call sort of robust control, right? And I think we all lack this kind of robust control, and that's just a reality that we have to sort of learn to live with. And like, I think many of our value judgments can persevere in that world. Like, so for example, if you enjoy food, right? I don't think you stop enjoying food because you acknowledge that you enjoy a certain kind of food because that was the food you were raised with, and that's
Mhm.
comfort food for you or something. It doesn't stop making it comfort food to you or something. And similarly, you know, something can be wrong, something can be immoral, and we can try to prevent people from doing it, whether or not anybody has anything like free will.
Yeah, I think that this might be getting a bit into like the esoteric, but I think that you just kind of like hit on something that has been floating around in the back of my mind, which is I feel like that some of the resistance to this idea comes from, and it may be cultural, it may be just part of what it is to be human. I don't know. But for a lot of people, there seems to be this need that we'll just use enjoyment. This can abstract to other things, but we'll use enjoyment, like just
Mm-hmm.
hedonic pleasure of like just eating a food you like. That there has to be some value to that experience beyond just the enjoyment of there has to be something more to it than the thing
Mm-hmm.
itself in that
Mm-hmm.
moment that it's happening. And right, if like for instance, like
Mm-hmm.
love, right? Like I love my partner. There's this need for that love to transcend something that we
Mm-hmm.
are not. Do you get what I'm saying? Like there's a
Yeah.
need for it to be more than just the thing that it is in the moment that it's happening. And once you let go of that and just say, this is a thing that's happening that is good now, and that's it, and vibe, like
Mm-hmm.
everything, you stop. Am I making sense? I'm talking a little out of my depth here.
I mean, yeah, well, I think there is something to like this is all connected, I think, to this sort of issues of meaning that folks are dealing
Mhm.
with right now. I think a lot of folks are struggling to like feel a sense of meaning, and sort of various systems in our world right now conspire to make it much harder to feel like people have meaning. And then I think, if you just dump this stuff on them on top of all of that, it will sort of further deprive them of an ability to feel like anything matters beyond this one hedonic moment or something. And that might radically alter how they, make plans or decisions or something like that. I don't think that follows from this view. And it's funny because in that same Mortal Questions book, there's a chapter about the absurd where Nagel talks about the concern of people like, well, my life isn't going to matter a million years from now. So how does it matter at all? Right.
Mhm.
These different attempts to try to ground meaning in some sort of larger impact or something like that. And I think that's something that is psychologically understandable. And I think we can get some version of it even if what I'm saying is all true, right? I don't think that like my view necessitates a very simplistic hedonism approach to valuing, right? You can still value a long-term accomplishment, even recognizing that your success in it is the result of luck or something like that. Or you can still value helping other people, even if you realize that your ability to do so is the result of various kinds of privilege or something like that.
Okay. In what way would you say that the value extends off of that? Like,
Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, going back to our discussion of intrinsic value, right? I
mm,
just think I think several things have intrinsic value. I think hedonic states have intrinsic value, but I also think flourishing has intrinsic value, and I
mm,
think flourishing is a more thicker concept than just hedonic pleasure, right? It's about a kind of growth that a person experiences, an improvement in their capacities, an improvement in their illusion of agency, right? In the sense that someone
mm,
who is flourishing generally feels that they are more free and have more control in these kinds of ways. Um, I think those things are all valuable. I also think things like, caring relationships are intrinsically valuable in the sense that, like, it's good that you have a committed relationship to your partner, and that goodness transcends beyond the transactional nature of that relationship for the two of you,
mm,
right? Like, there is now, what is that extra value? Well, intrinsic value is weird, right? It's one of those weird things in philosophy. What is it? I don't know. It's weird. But like, I don't think that like I think if you try to use free will to answer that question, you're doing the sort of logical fallacy of resolving one mystery with another mystery, right? You've just
mm.
swapped in a different problem in a sense. But like, I don't think we should do intrinsic value that way, right? I think we should do intrinsic value as its own separate, really hard problem. But I also think we can't jettison intrinsic value. I think things have it, and B, I think without it, our valuing system would collapse.
Yeah. Okay, good. I think that's a good encapsulation of all that. And now, with the time remaining, I kind of want to hit you with what I think are sort of like, let's just say everybody everywhere agrees with
Mhm.
us, right?
Mhm.
There's there's still a way that this idea can be used for evil, and
Sure.
I thought maybe we could talk about some of the talk about and then debunk some of the potential uh, more voidy uses of moral luck. And the one that I always come back to is we've talked a lot about crime and circumstance. I can very easily imagine a person who has completely onboarded the idea of moral luck, also taking the extra step and saying, well, now we have to be paternalistic towards a given population of people because of like X trait. And then like you get into like race and IQ stuff, and it gets very dark very quickly.
Right.
So
yeah, and like that is a consistent concern, I think, with my approach is, are you sliding into a really harmful kind of paternalism, right? Because once you accept this view, and this goes back to the sort of concern that you were mentioning earlier about like agency and autonomy, even if you don't think that like, oh, this person doesn't have agency, they have no more value, there might be another concern, which is if you adopt my view, you become a little bit more comfortable with trade-offs that involve depriving people of their agency for the greater good or something like that, right? I don't know about whether that is actually the case empirically yet. Like, I think we don't have, it's a very fine-grained question, and like I don't know of any studies that would like clearly bear on that question. It does seem plausible to me, like, so I don't think it's something that we can dismiss as being like an implausible concern. I think the idea again, so this is similar to my discussion about like something like moral realism. Strong ideas are dangerous, right? Like an idea that is compelling, that can grip people, right, and that can move them to action, can always be used for evil. And whether that's saying things are objectively immoral or saying that like people ultimately lack free will, that is certainly a risk. And I think this again comes back to why we need an active pedagogy of luck that's about helping people understand that this view doesn't necessitate some naive eugenics or, some naive biological determinism or something like that, that like the causal influences are complex and questions about paternalism have to be taken seriously, even if people lack free will. It's again, a sort of Brave New World kind of thing. We can't just slide into that kind of space. I don't think we have to, though. Like, I think that you can train people not to go into that place. And I also think that, like, at the end of the day, as you sort of mentioned earlier, like the noble lie approach, the meritocracy approach also spirals people into horrible places. So it's not like you can't get to really, really terrible places from the opposing view, unless you can show that my view necessarily sends, vastly more people into that space. Then I don't think it's a good argument against my view. It's an argument in favor of, sophisticated education on these issues.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I just would be remiss if I didn't.
Oh no, I like objections.
Do you have any like? What would you consider? This is probably a good question. He's thought out loud. What would you consider to be the best counter like argument to your position on moral luck, and like how do you like steelman that, and then like how do you get around it, or how do you get through it?
Yeah, so I don't have like a very strong pushback on the like no free will side of the thing, but I do think that like you could give me a lot of a hard time about like where I draw the line on which parts of the old model we keep versus which parts we get rid of, right? Like it's easy for me to pick, favorable examples like reforming the justice system so that it's more rehabilitative and restorative rather than punitive. That's a low-hanging fruit kind of question. But then we get into questions about like, when you're raising young people, do you still praise them? Do you still punish them? How do you do those things? Is it still ethical? And like fundamental questions about like on this view, if everybody is kind of fundamentally an innocent in the sense that like, we're all the products of luck in this way and so don't deserve to be punished, are we accepting a kind of immoral system that still in effect punishes and praises and rewards people, and we're just being hypocritical about it, or just like plastering over some nice new language or something like that? Like those are the concerns that keep me up at night for sure.
Yeah, I think one of the so my relationship philosophically to like punishment is framed in this sort of moral luck system, and it's we should only punish people to the extent that we can show that that punishment reliably produces better outcomes for both that person and other people. Like punitive
Mm-hmm.
measures really should only exist when they have like a very like hard, like a very utilitarian function. Like they
Mm-hmm.
produce the results we want. Other than that, there's no reason to it. It's just unnecessary cruelty. But that view I can very easily see spiraling into sort of like a, little kid locked up in the basement of Omelas. If we punish this one, like that's a doorway to like essentially like broken windows policing thinking in a certain regard. Like you can
Mm-hmm.
justify any amount of punishment so long as it produces the appropriate number of like good things that we've weighed against the suffering of that one person. And that is I think
Mm-hmm.
a dark place that my philosophy can go to. And I
Mm-hmm.
haven't quite figured out how to wrestle with that.
So I mean, I'm a thoroughgoing pluralist when it comes to my normative ethics, and so I don't worry about that because I'm a squish, and I'll be like, well, look, there's a point at which like violating the person's again air quotes autonomy agency right in this kind of way is
Mhm.
still unethical, is still producing harms, but also like treating them in a way like I still think we should treat people as ends in themselves and not as means to an ends, for example.
Mhm.
Like I don't think we lose that view just because we can't base it on this kind of radical idea of the free intending will as sort of Kant lays it out. um, there's a related objection here that I'll also throw in that I think is compelling to some folks, and I don't have a full answer to, which is like, does this view mean that the suffering of victims is not taken seriously enough? Right? That
Mhm.
like, if we have somebody who doesn't, like is fairly easy to rehabilitate or something like that, and we don't feel the need to keep them locked up for deterrent reasons or anything else like that. um is it problematic that they have this kind of positive experience where the people who they caused suffering to have a negative experience? Right? Is that like, are we allowing for a kind of unfairness there? And I think that's something to be worried about too. I don't think the solution is to up the punitiveness of your punishment model. But I do think that like our restorative approaches, for example, need to take seriously those kinds of realities, those kinds of costs to what the persistence of harmful behavior, which is not going to go away. If my view is like, hopefully on my view, people will maybe act more ethically, but there's no guarantee on that, certainly. And certainly some percentage will still continue to not act ethically or not adopt my view. So you're always going to be dealing with these kinds of behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is an interesting like pathway or like question or stumbling block, whatever. But
Hmm.
like say you have just to like coarse grain it, you have like a serial killer, right? Like if we figured out that Ted Bundy was Ted Bundy because he had like a tumor in his brain that caused that was solely responsible for all of his negative behavior, and we could go in and excise that tumor, and now Ted Bundy is essentially like the most pure moral creature that's ever lived. He's now like a Buddhist monk who does like donates blood and like feeds the homeless or whatever. Like he's now a
Hmm.
perfect moral
Hmm. Hmm.
paragon. And literally the only difference between those two versions of him is a surgical procedure. You
Hmm.
know, one, are we obligated to perform that procedure? Two, even if the
Hmm.
Ted Bundy beforehand would not want us to, uh, which is a sticky thing. And then two, if we do it,
Right.
should the new person not have to suffer any punitive harm in recompense for the damage that the previous variant of that individual caused, right? Like, I don't know how to wrestle with that.
Yeah, it's a good sci-fi, right? I should do a philosophers. Find me a sci-fi, and I'll do a philosophers in space on it. I I think it's a hard. I don't think we should treat it as an easy question.
It was an episode of Star Trek Voyager.
Oh, was it? Oh, right. What is that? What is that episode? You're right. I got to dig that up. Oh no, wait. We did that one, or was there?
Did you? It was the.
Oh no,
the guy
we did the Babylon 5 version of it. That's so funny. There's a Babylon 5 version of this with Brad Dourif, who's the best actor ever. And like he's a character who was a monster serial killer, whatever, and like got his memory wiped, and then like is this good upstanding person or something. And like the question, it's absolutely, I think, it's a hard question, right? I lean towards thinking like, what do we really want? Do we want to just punish people for the sake of like a sense of fairness? And does that mean this kind of return to something closer to an eye for an eye approach? Or if we've moved past that, like, and you can really help somebody and like restore and rehabilitate their behavior in this really robust kind of way, and then they could live as functioning members of society, like it's hard for me, especially if you're doing something where you're like radically changing their personalities. So like, let's imagine that the new Bundy doesn't even remember committing the crimes. Like, it's very hard for me to think of why we should still keep that person in prison. I can't see a good argument for doing so. That may be a weird bullet to bite, but yeah, I think that's now there are separate ethical questions about like, is it okay for us to override their agency and do this surgery on them without their consent? And I'm not even sure the answer there is a clear no either.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, that's the more interesting question to me, honestly, is if we have, let's just say Ted Bundy, right? Ted Bundy's in prison, right? Ted Bundy can no longer hurt anyone ever again. And even like Ted Bundy will conceivably remain in prison regardless of what we do, right? He's completely isolated from the world. We have stopped all harm this person will ever do. And we can do this. We know we can do it reliably. We know what the results will reliably be, but Ted Bundy doesn't want it done. What do we do in that situation? That to me is like the really because that really gets to the heart of, I think, the ethical problem. Maybe problem isn't the best way to phrase it, but the ethical fuzziness in rehabilitative justice is, what if the person doesn't want to be rehabilitated? Do we have to respect their agency?
Right. And one move that I could make here that is a common philosophical move is at this point to object to toy example, which is to say, in that very, very specific hypothetical that you've created, yes, my view has this position, but back in reality where we live, there's never going to be any such surgery, right? There's never going to be like it seems to me it's highly unlikely that we're going to understand the nature of the moral mind in such a way where like what you're going to get is something more like lobotomies, right?
Yeah.
And so like that's a different sort of complex ethical question. And I think we're better off sort of not going in that direction. Now, I mean, there's an interesting example, right? There's a guy that I often bring up in the moral luck discussion, a story of a guy who was a high school teacher who just starts having strong pedophiliac urges, right? Really bad, suddenly attracted to young people urges, right? And I have to remember the details, but I think, he either goes in for treatment or gets in trouble or something like that. And they do studies of him and they do tests on his brain. And they find here's this, lesion, or here's this like thing in your brain, tumor in your brain that is like making you have these urges, and we're going to take it out. And they take it out and it goes away. Right. And like, I think later this thing comes back and like the urges come back. And so, you have examples like that are closer to sort of what you're describing, where there's a serious and knowable biological defect that, if corrected, substantially corrects the person's moral behavior. And there it seems like there's a pretty good, good argument for doing that sort of treatment, even if the person's current mental state puts them in a place where they don't want you to do that. Right. I think there's something to be said that, like, if somebody starts developing a kind of alternate personality because of brain trauma or something like that you can reverse or deal with or something, then like it makes sense to do that thing. But like consent questions are very complicated. Like bioethics is not there's no easy answers on those sorts of issues.
Yeah. It's just, you could go down an entire just litany of like, there's a really dark variant of that where you're just pathologizing crime to the extent of like bioessentialism. Like, there are dark roads that you could go down, and I think,
Pre-crime.
yeah, like I'm of the mind that like, like I think like you said, the example is not the thing, and we can. I think it's cool to talk about these ideas just so that we have reference points for when we eventually encounter things that are somewhat similar. Like we've laid down
Right.
various markers, and we're not quite. It's sort of like sending like in Star Trek, right? They always shoot a probe out like, before they get there, and it's not like what you're going to see, but like we kind of have a rough idea of what's happening. I think that's important. But like if you are cleaving to some abstract thought experiment,
Mm-hmm.
the conclusions of a thought experiment, irrespective of their actual material, like real world consequences that didn't come up, like you've like started map versus territory, basically.
Yeah, and I would also add that like a lot of the concern between utopia and dystopia is like what policy actually is enacted for addressing the problem, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think denying the existence of the problem is the right solution. I do recognize that there are like bad policy directions that you could go down like pre-crime, but I also think that like being concerned about that is indicative of living in a carceral state like the one we live in where but like if you take that sort of hypothetical and instead you're like targeting people with aid and services and things like that, then you're just describing a functioning society, right? Then you're just describing like a really good system that appears to be helping reduce, things that harm people's quality of life.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like, yes, it could be used in dystopian ways, but like literally that's the point of biopower is every tool can be used in dystopian ways.
Yeah.
Like having a tool is a potential concern, but that doesn't mean that we should smash all the tools or pretend there isn't a problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, and I think that speaks more to like my automatic taking it to the worst possible version that it could possibly be. I think speaks to just living in a police state, and having seen the results of that. Like,
yeah, I think it's understandable, and like I get being concerned that my view will then be co-opted and used in that kind of way. That is a legitimate concern. I just think that like the current model is also being very obviously co-opted to put a very thin veneer of ethical justice on what is clearly a deeply unjust system, right? Like part of the point of meritocratic rhetoric, in my opinion, not the people who genuinely believe it, like there are folks who genuinely are in favor of it, but like a lot of the political rhetoric around it is about making a world in which we can say, look, if these people are worse off, that's their problem. That's their own fault. And it's not our problem. And we don't have to give them services or help them out in these various kinds of ways. And I think that I think you can push back on that very effectively without doing this thing that everyone so often I will have people be like, oh, well, now you're just saying that those people have no free will, that they're just children or they're just, I'm like, look, none of us have any free will. Like we're all addicts to social media. We're all addicts to a bunch of things that like, you're all ridiculous if you pretend that we don't all have at least 3 addictions at this point in our lives. So like, let's just be more honest about that and, use strong no smoking campaigns to try to get people addicted to weed instead of cigarettes or something like that. Like, changing vices, as my boy Bill Hicks would say, right? We're just trading off vices here.
Yeah, I think, I strongly agree. I think we should, regardless of any path towards dystopia that the views may lead, we already live in a dystopia. Like we already live in a world beyond the nightmares of William Gibson. It's just a little more boring because real life usually is. And yeah, I think that the moral luck philosophy is a good pathway to making the world groovier, which is ultimately my entire goal.
Yeah, basically. And like that's where I come. I mean, like also, I can talk about my own personal experiences and why I personally am sympathetic to this view. And I will caveat whenever you're talking to a philosopher, they're probably telling you more about themselves than about the actual world a lot of the time. So like, take everything I say here with a grain of salt. But like, I genuinely am at a place now where I don't remember what it was like to believe in free will and to not sort of hold this view. And, while like I said, I'll still get angry sort of briefly, it does very quickly switch over to like, these people just have there's no control, and like being mad at them is silly. Like at the end of the day, it's just me being more miserable because they're miserable, and they're miserable because of things beyond their control. So, like you said, you come back to this kind of compassion place, and you have to be careful there not to like let that turn into letting people walk all over you or something like that. There is a point at which you push back and such. So like, I never want any of this to be like, and at the end of the day, there's no trade-offs and we solve all the issues because we've all adopted my view. I just think that like the cost benefit analysis for my approach is better than the alternative, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe a good way to bottle it would be that we should be angry at circumstances and sympathetic to people.
Yeah, or right, to crib from the theists, right? Hate the sin, love the sinner.
All right. Well, we will. I think that might be a good spot to end it on, since two atheists quoting the Bible.
But for the grace of the void, go I. Hey, look, I'll take anybody's language I can that'll help, and I think that like joking aside, this does highlight that luck, the belief in luck, is a cross-cultural thing, and some of the belief, some of that thing earlier that I said about like everybody intuitively has a libertarian view. There's a good chance that is a artifact, that our version of that is an artifact of studying of mostly Western, educated, intellectual, blah 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 blah, the weird people, as they are referred to technically. There is difference. There's variation across culture in terms of what people think about the relationship between the self and the community, and what that means for things like luck and free will and stuff like that. So, I think culturally relevant pedagogy of luck is important, right? I often am talking towards an American audience who have a very, very extreme view about individuality. Like, all of the studies suggest that Americans are at the end of the weird spectrum, not just in the weird spectrum, but at the far end of the spectrum on these sorts of issues. And I think it has very negative consequences for us. So a lot of what I'm doing is a cultural corrective to that intuitive way that I think we are raised. And part of that is about helping people recognize, your intuitions about radically individuals' selves is a product of cultural habituation and not necessarily indicative of something you're actually experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Aaron Rabinowitz, it has been an absolute pleasure. I appreciate you joining me. Do you want to plug your pluggables?
Yeah, thanks as always for having me on. Folks who want to find me, you can check me out at ETVPod on Twitter, where I will always talk about luck or any number of issues. You can also find my shows on all the pod apps. Embrace the Void for interviews of various sorts, and Philosophers in Space for talking about science fiction and philosophy.
All right.
And also, let me also plug, I have a monthly column in the UK Skeptic Mag, run by Merseyside Skeptics. They're a great org. It's a great publication, and I feel very privileged to be allowed to write in it. So thanks.
Yeah. And a link to all of that stuff, including Aaron's article on moral luck in The Skeptic, will be in the show notes and on the website. Everybody go check those out. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards again. I want to thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Watching or listening. I think there's about, currently, at the time that I'm recording this anyway, which is right at the tail end of January, I have like about 300 or so people who reliably watch on the YouTube, and I have about 200 people who reliably watch or listen on the podcast. And I don't know if there's cross-pollination between those populations, so I will say that there's at least 200 of you who regularly consume my content, and at most about 500. And however many that number actually is, I love you all and I appreciate it immensely. If you want to support me financially and keep the show going and keep the lights on over here and all that good stuff, you can do so on Patreon, where you can give me a monthly contribution that I will cherish forever. In exchange for that, you will get early access to the audio of the show. You can also give me a one-time donation via Venmo, Coffee, or PayPal. All of those are all at Ultraviolet Pod. If you are unable to support the show financially, that's cool too. No sweat, no pressure. But you can actually help support the show directly and in a very meaningful way by liking and subscribing to me on YouTube, by hitting the, if you're on YouTube, if you're one of the YouTube folks, hitting the little bell that lets you know when I've got a new episode out. That will assure that you see what I produce, despite any algorithmic nonsense that may come up. But anything that you do to engage with my content, be it subscribe to YouTube, be it leaving a comment, liking and giving 5 stars on your podcasting apps, all of that helps me get boosted in algorithms, and it really does make a difference. So please go out there and do all that. If you want to engage with me directly, you can do so by subscribing to my Twitter feed. I am at Ultraviolet Pod. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, but really infrequently. Those aren't great ways to get a hold of me, but that's also at Ultraviolet Pod. I am on Twitch incredibly infrequently, but occasionally I do play games. If you want to know when that happens, then sub to me on there. That's at UVPod. And then my email is ultravioletpod@gmail.com, which is another way you can get a hold of me directly. However you support the show, however you interface with this content, I want you to know that I really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one.